In the middle of the 19th century, when America was still wild and untamed, a small boy sat on the back of a wagon, watching the world roll by. His name was John Peters Ringo, the boy who would one day be known as Johnny Ringo, the Haunted Gunslinger of the West. Johnny was born on May 3, 1850, in a quiet part of Greene County, Indiana. His family wasn't rich, but they were proud and hopeful. His father, Martin Ringo, was a strong man who believed the future was waiting out west, where land was free and a man could build his own destiny. His mother, Mary Ringo, was gentle and kind, always trying to hold the family together while Martin chased his dream. Like many families of the time, the Ringos packed up their lives and began the long, hard journey west. They traveled in a wagon train, rolling slowly through miles of empty land, through heat, through dust, through danger. The journey was long, but little Johnny was curious. He would stare out at the endless plains and wonder what kind of life waited for him at the end of the road. But dreams often turned to dust in the Old West. One quiet afternoon, while the family stopped to rest, tragedy struck. Martin Ringo, Johnny's father, stepped down from the wagon to check his gun. In that moment, the weapon went off. The sound echoed across the empty plains, one single shot, and then silence. Martin fell to the ground, the gun still in his hand. He had accidentally shot himself in the head. Johnny, just 14 years old, saw it happen. He ran to his father's side, calling his name again and again, but there was nothing anyone could do. That image, his father's body lying still in the dirt, never left his mind. It followed him through the years, like a ghost that refused to let go. Soft, haunting music begins. After that day, something changed inside Johnny. He became quiet, thoughtful, always lost in his own world. The laughter of childhood faded away, replaced by long silences and a stare that seemed far older than his years. The Ringos buried Martin near their wagon trail and moved on. But Johnny never really did. Part of him stayed behind, in that lonely patch of land where his father fell. When the family finally settled in Texas, Johnny tried to start again. The land was rough, the people even rougher. Men carried guns not for show, but for survival. Johnny learned to ride, to rope, and to shoot. At first, it was just a skill, a way to protect himself. But soon, shooting became something more. It became a language he understood, the only way he could express what he carried inside. By the time he was in his early 20s, Johnny Ringo was known around town. He wasn't like the other cowboys. He didn't laugh loud or brag in saloons. He was polite, quiet, and well-spoken. He liked reading, poetry, philosophy, even the Bible. He could quote Shakespeare one minute and draw a gun the next. That combination made him dangerous, not just to others, but to himself. Because deep down, Johnny Ringo wasn't just a man looking for a fight. He was a man looking for peace, and he didn't know how to find it. Texas in those days was full of violence. Ranchers, rustlers, and settlers were all fighting for power, land, and survival. Johnny got pulled into one of these deadly feuds, the Mason County War. It was a bitter conflict between local cattlemen and German immigrants. No one really remembered how it started, but everyone knew how it ended, in blood. Ringo found himself right in the middle. He rode with men who believed justice came from the barrel of a gun. Over time, he grew cold to killing, not proud, but numb. Each gunfight left another scar, another ghost. People began to fear his name. They said Johnny Ringo had ice in his veins, that he never missed, that he never flinched. But those who really looked into his eyes saw something else. Sadness. A sadness so deep it made you wonder if he wanted to live at all. Johnny Ringo wasn't a villain, though history often paints him that way. He was more like a man born in the wrong time, too intelligent for the world he lived in, too broken to escape it. He longed for peace but only knew war. He searched for meaning but only found violence. And no matter how far he rode, he could never outrun that one sound, the echo of his father's gun. The story of Johnny Ringo is not just about bullets and blood. It's about a boy who saw death too soon, and a man who carried it forever. It's about the haunting silence that follows a tragedy, and the desperate search to fill it. For Ringo, the Old West was not a place of freedom. It was a mirror, reflecting the pain he tried to forget. And though the world would come to know him as a killer, those who met him often said the same thing. Johnny Ringo wasn't evil. He was just lost, but destiny wasn't done with him yet. Somewhere out in Arizona, another town was waiting, a place called Tombstone. And there, Ringo's legend would collide with history itself. Texas in the 1870s was a land without peace. It was a place where the wind carried the sound of gunfire and men lived with their hands always near their belts. In this hard world, Johnny Ringo became a man. After the death of his father, Johnny had grown quiet, thoughtful, and cautious. But deep inside, a fire burned, a restless energy he didn't understand. The West was full of opportunity, but it was also full of danger. Every man had to decide which side of the gun he was going to stand on. Johnny was smart, smarter than most. He could read and write when many couldn't even sign their own names. He spent his nights with books, reading about history, faith, and philosophy. People who met him often said he was polite and calm, a gentleman even. But those same people also said his eyes told a different story. They said he looked like a man who'd already seen too much death. As he grew older, Johnny started working around cattle ranches in central Texas. He could handle a horse like he was born in the saddle. But Texas was a rough place, and sooner or later, trouble came to everyone who lived there. That trouble came in the form of the Mason County War, one of the bloodiest feuds in Texas history. It began in the early 1870s, a bitter fight between German settlers who had built towns and ranchers who felt pushed aside. At first it was about stolen cattle, then it became about revenge. No one remembers who fired the first shot. But by the time the smoke cleared, whole families were destroyed. Johnny Ringo was drawn into the middle of it. Some say he joined because his friends were involved. Others say he believed he was fighting for justice. But justice in those days was decided by whoever had the faster gun. Ringo rode with a man named Scott Cooley, a tough, loyal fighter who became his close friend. Cooley was like an older brother to him, brave, fierce, and full of anger. When Cooley's adoptive father was killed by German settlers, Cooley swore revenge, and Ringo rode with him. Together they hunted the men they blamed, one by one. What started as justice turned into a killing spree. The newspapers called them outlaws, but in their minds, they were soldiers in a private war. Johnny Ringo's name began to spread across Texas. People said he was fast, deadly, and calm. Too calm. They said he could shoot without flinching, and when the smoke cleared, he would just stare at the bodies in silence. Yet those who knew him personally described him differently. They said Johnny wasn't proud of killing. He didn't brag or celebrate after a fight. He just looked tired, as if each man he shot took a piece of his soul away. By the end of the Mason County War, more than a dozen men were dead, and Texas law was closing in. Ringo and his gang became wanted men. Rangers hunted them across the plains, and the public began to whisper their names with both fear and fascination. Johnny didn't see himself as a villain. In his mind, he had done what needed to be done. But even he could feel something changing. The boy who once read poetry under the stars had become a man who solved problems with a bullet. Eventually, the law caught up with him. Johnny Ringo was arrested for his role in the Mason County killings. He was taken to jail and held for months waiting for trial. During that time, he surprised everyone. He was polite to the guards, friendly to other prisoners, and often seen reading books in his cell. Some said he talked about starting over once he was released, about leaving Texas for good. When he finally walked out of that jail, he didn't look back. Texas had given him nothing but blood and ghosts. So he rode west, toward Arizona, toward a new beginning, but no man escapes his past. Out on the open desert trails, Johnny rode alone. He had a calm, steady look, but inside he was tired. The faces of the men he'd killed haunted his dreams. He drank whiskey to forget. But the memories always came back. He drifted from town to town, taking work when he could, gambling when he couldn't. He was charming enough to win friends, quiet enough to keep them guessing. But there was always something distant about him, something cold. People started calling him the gentleman outlaw. He wore clean clothes, spoke softly, and never cursed in front of women. But when trouble came, that same soft-spoken man could draw his gun faster than anyone else. In a world full of rough cowboys and bandits, Johnny Ringo stood apart. He wasn't a fool or a show-off. He was a thinker trapped in a time of violence, a man too clever and too emotional for the life he was forced to live. As he made his way through the Arizona territory, his reputation grew. Stories spread in saloons and campfires about the polite man who never missed a shot. Some said he was cursed. Others said he was searching for something he'd never find. Peace. The West was changing. Law was coming, towns were growing, and the old days of gunfighters were fading. Johnny Ringo didn't fit anywhere anymore. He wasn't a bandit, but he wasn't innocent either. He carried his father's ghost, the faces of his enemies, and the weight of every choice he'd ever made. And as he rode farther west toward a town called Tombstone, he had no idea that he was heading straight into history and into the final chapter of his haunted life. When Johnny Ringo rode into the Arizona territory, he was no longer the boy who watched his father die or the young man who fought through Texas feuds. He was something different now, quieter, colder, and wiser. The years had taught him that every gunfight left a mark, even if no one could see it. He was around 30 years old then, tall, lean, and serious. His face was handsome but worn by sun and sorrow. His eyes, pale and distant, seemed to stare past the world into something far away. Those who met him said he could make a man nervous without ever raising his voice. Arizona in those days was still wild but full of promise. Mining towns were rising fast and saloons glowed at night like beacons in the desert. Cowboys, gamblers, drifters, and dreamers all crossed paths there, each chasing their own idea of freedom. Johnny fit right in, yet somehow he still stood apart. He didn't drink much at first. He preferred quiet company and intelligent conversation. He read books others ignored. He could quote Shakespeare, discuss philosophy, or talk about the Bible with surprising depth. Many called him the gentleman outlaw. In a place where most men measured worth by how quick they could draw a gun, Johnny's calm nature was unsettling. He carried himself like someone who had nothing left to prove. He spoke softly, dressed neatly, and treated even strangers with respect. But everyone knew that if things turned violent, Ringo could end it in a heartbeat. He began spending time in the small towns scattered across southeastern Arizona, Galeyville, Chiricahua, and later Tombstone. Wherever he went, his reputation seemed to arrive first. Stories of the Mason County War followed him like shadows. Some feared him, others admired him. But everyone respected him. Johnny wasn't just another gun for hire. He wasn't loud or reckless. He didn't rob banks or hold up stagecoaches. He made his living through gambling, horse trading, and sometimes helping ranchers settle disputes, often with his revolver nearby just in case. People noticed his contradictions. He was a man of violence who disliked cruelty, a drifter who carried himself like a scholar, an outlaw who followed his own strange code of honor. Once, a drunken cowboy insulted him in a saloon, calling him a fake, saying no real gunman read poetry. Johnny didn't move at first. He just looked at the man for a long, silent moment. Then, with a calm voice, he said, "Reading makes a man think before he kills." The room went quiet. The cowboy backed down. Moments like that built his legend. He didn't need to draw his gun to win a fight. His words and presence were often enough, but under that cool surface, the ghosts were still there. The things he had seen and done in Texas never really left him. Some nights, when the desert was silent and the stars hung low, he would drink alone and talk to himself. Those who saw him said it was as if he was having conversations with people long gone. He tried to find peace through solitude. He spent time in the mountains, away from crowds, camping beside rivers and writing in small notebooks he carried with him. But every time he came back to town, trouble seemed to find him. In Arizona, he met the cowboys, a loose group of outlaws and ranchers who worked together, sometimes herding cattle, sometimes stealing them. They were led by men like Curly Bill Brocious and Ike Clanton, rough men who lived fast and feared no law. At first, Johnny didn't fit with them. He was quieter, more thoughtful, but over time he became part of their circle. The cowboys liked him because he was fearless and loyal. He liked them because they didn't judge him for his past. It was during this time that his path crossed with men who would change his life forever. Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, and most importantly, Doc Holliday. Holliday was everything Ringo was, and everything he wasn't. A gambler, a drinker, a killer, but also educated and sharp-minded. Both men were haunted in their own ways, both carrying pain, pride, and a thirst for meaning. From the moment they met, there was tension, like two storm clouds circling each other in the same sky. Some said they respected one another, Others said they hated each other instantly. Whatever the truth, everyone in Tombstone could feel the electricity when Johnny Ringo and Doc Holliday were in the same room. While the Earps tried to bring law to Tombstone, the cowboys saw them as enemies, men who stood between them and their way of life. Johnny often found himself caught between his intellect and his loyalty, between doing what was right and doing what felt inevitable. He wasn't a hero, but he wasn't evil either. He was a man trying to survive in a world that was slowly dying. The Old West was changing, and men like Johnny Ringo were running out of time. As months passed, Ringo's drinking grew heavier. His calm, polite nature began to crack under the weight of his past and the pressure around him. He was seen wandering the streets late at night, speaking softly to himself, eyes unfocused. To most people, he was still the gentleman outlaw, but to those who looked closer, he was becoming something else, a man at war with his own soul. Johnny Ringo wasn't chasing fame or fortune anymore. He was chasing peace. But peace, in the Wild West, was as rare as mercy. And as Tombstone's tensions grew toward the showdown that would make history, Johnny Ringo was walking straight toward his fate, one that would seal his name forever in legend. By the early 1880s, Tombstone, Arizona had become the center of everything the West stood for: ambition, greed, lawlessness, and legend. Silver had been found in the nearby hills, and people came from every corner of America hoping to strike it rich. The desert that once lay silent was now alive with noise. Pickaxes, wagon wheels, laughter, and gunfire. But where there's gold or silver, there's always trouble. Tombstone was split between two kinds of people. On one side were the lawmen and businessmen, led by Wyatt Earp and his brothers. They believed in order, justice, and profit. On the other side were the cowboys, a loose band of outlaws, drifters, and ranchers who lived by their own code. They moved cattle across the border, sometimes honestly, sometimes not. In between them stood a man who didn't fully belong to either world, Johnny Ringo. When Ringo arrived in Tombstone, people already knew his name. His reputation as a fast and deadly gunfighter had reached the town before he did. But he wasn't like most outlaws. He didn't ride in looking for trouble. He came quietly, kept to himself, and stayed mostly in the background. He soon found company among the cowboys, men like Curly Bill Brocious, Ike Clanton, and Billy Clanton. They were rough, loud, and dangerous, but they treated Johnny with respect. They knew he was different. When he spoke, they listened. When he gave advice, they followed it. Johnny had become something like the mind of the cowboys, smart, calm, and often the one who kept them from making foolish choices. But even he couldn't stop what was coming. Tombstone was a powder keg, and everyone could smell the smoke. The Earp brothers were determined to bring the cowboys under control. They believed the gang's cross-border cattle theft and stagecoach robberies were ruining the town's reputation. But the cowboys saw the Earps as hypocrites, men who used the law for their own power. Caught between pride and politics, both sides began pushing harder. Wyatt Earp wanted law and order. Johnny Ringo wanted freedom, and Doc Holliday, Wyatt's loyal friend, was the spark between them. Johnny and Doc were opposites in many ways, yet strangely similar. Both were intelligent, well-educated, and deadly. Both lived with sickness, Doc with tuberculosis, Johnny with his own invisible pain. They recognized something in each other, something familiar. Their first real meeting became the stuff of legend. It was at a poker table in one of Tombstone's saloons. Doc Holliday was drinking, laughing, and showing off his sharp tongue. Johnny Ringo walked in, calm, clean, polite. The crowd quieted immediately. They began speaking in Latin, trading lines from scripture and poetry like two duelists testing one another's wit. No one drew a gun that night, but everyone who witnessed it said they could feel the tension. Two haunted men, both too smart for the world around them, staring into each other's souls. After that, the town buzzed with talk. People said it was only a matter of time before Johnny Ringo and Doc Holliday met again, this time not with words, but with bullets. Still, Ringo didn't go looking for a fight. In truth, he was tired of blood. He often tried to calm things down to avoid another senseless killing. But the world around him was changing too fast, and the violence he tried to escape kept finding him. Then came October 26, 1881, the day that would echo through history. The gunfight at the OK Corral. Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp and Doc Holliday faced off against the Clanton and McClory brothers. In less than 30 seconds, 3 men were dead and the Old West changed forever. Johnny Ringo wasn't there that day, but the aftermath pulled him straight into the storm. The cowboys wanted revenge. The Earps prepared for war. And Tombstone, once a booming mining town, became a battlefield. As the bloodshed continued, Ringo's role grew uncertain. Some cowboys wanted him to lead them against the Earps. Others said he was losing his nerve. He still carried his gun, but his heart wasn't in the fight anymore. He had seen too much death, too much senseless killing. The thrill was gone. Only exhaustion remained. He began drinking more, wandering the streets late at night. Locals said he talked to himself, sometimes quoting poetry, sometimes mumbling the names of the dead. The once calm and controlled Johnny Ringo was starting to unravel. He tried to find peace in small ways. Long rides in the desert, quiet days in the hills. But peace was something men like him were never meant to have. By the time the Earps left Tombstone, the legend of Johnny Ringo had already taken root. Some saw him as the outlaw who stood up to the law. Others saw him as a tragic figure, too smart and too sad for his own time. Tombstone would go down in history as the town of legends. Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Johnny Ringo. 3 names forever tied together, but for Johnny the story was far from over. His greatest battle wasn't with the Earps, or with Doc Holliday, or with the law. It was with himself. And that battle was only beginning. After the smoke of the OK Corral cleared, Tombstone was a town on edge. The Earps were hailed as heroes by some and hunted by others. The cowboys were furious, mourning their dead and plotting revenge. In the middle of this storm stood Johnny Ringo, the man everyone whispered about but few really knew. He was not one for crowds. He spent more time in the quiet corners of saloons than at the center of chaos. Yet his name kept surfacing whenever talk turned to vengeance. Some said he was now the leader of the cowboys. Others believed he was the only one smart enough to hold them back. The truth, as always with Ringo, lived somewhere in the shadows. The weeks after the gunfight were soaked in blood. Retaliation followed retaliation. Wyatt Earp's brother Virgil was shot and crippled. Morgan Earp was murdered while playing pool. Wyatt formed a vendetta posse and rode out for justice, or vengeance, depending on who you asked. And as the Earps left Tombstone, Johnny Ringo stayed behind, carrying a reputation heavy enough to break most men. He wandered between saloons and desert camps, drinking more than ever. Locals said he could be charming when sober, but distant, as if he lived half in this world and half somewhere else. He would quote the Bible or Shakespeare one moment and then sit silently for hours, staring into nothing. But when word spread that Doc Holliday had returned to the Arizona Territory, everything changed. Holliday was Wyatt Earp's closest friend, and his temper was as sharp as his aim. The newspapers loved the idea of a final showdown between 2 of the fastest guns in the West, Johnny Ringo, the gentleman outlaw, and Doc Holliday, the deadly dentist. The tension grew until one hot summer day when both men found themselves in the same town, Tombstone again. Ringo was standing near a saloon, talking quietly with a few cowboys, when Holliday stepped into the street. The air turned still. People froze where they stood. Stories say the crowd could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Holliday looked thin and pale from sickness, but his hand hovered near his gun. Ringo, cool and steady, folded his arms and smiled. The 2 men faced each other in silence, eyes locked. Then, without a word, Ringo motioned with his hand, an invitation. Holliday's grin widened. Witnesses later said they spoke in Latin again, trading cryptic lines back and forth like fencers testing each other's reach. No one knew exactly what the words meant, but everyone understood what was coming. 2 legends. One street, one breath away from eternity. But the gunfight never came. Before either man could draw, Sheriff John Behan stepped between them. He knew what would happen if they fired. Tombstone would drown in blood again. He ordered them both to stand down, threatening arrest if they continued. Holliday laughed and turned away. Ringo stayed where he was for a long moment before slowly tipping his hat and walking off. And just like that, the duel that might have become the most famous in the West ended without a shot, yet, in the eyes of the people, it had already happened. The legend grew anyway. From that day on, the world saw them as eternal rivals, 2 haunted men circling each other in life and death. But for Johnny Ringo, the moment left a scar. It reminded him of everything he'd tried to escape. The fighting, the endless blood, the ghosts. He was tired. The weight of his past, his guilt, and his loneliness pressed heavier every day. He began drifting farther from the towns, spending more time alone in the hills and canyons. Friends noticed his drinking had worsened. Sometimes he would vanish for days, then reappear looking worn and hollow. One rancher remembered finding him sitting by a river, a bottle beside him, talking softly to the water. When asked who he was speaking to, Ringo just smiled and said, "Old friends." Inside, Johnny was breaking apart. He had lived his whole life by the gun, but now the gun no longer gave him purpose. He was still young, barely 32, but his spirit felt older than the desert itself. Rumors spread that he wanted to leave Arizona, maybe even start over in California. But the West never let go of its ghosts easily. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some wanted to drink with him, others to test their luck against the famous Johnny Ringo. He tried to stay calm, but the more people talked, the more restless he became. He told a friend once, "There's no peace for men like me. We just ride until the road runs out." That road was about to end. The duel that never happened with Doc Holliday became a turning point, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. Ringo had no enemy left to fight except himself. The violence, the fame, the fear. None of it filled the emptiness inside him. The same ghost that had followed him since his father's death still rode beside him, whispering through the wind, in the eyes of the world. Johnny Ringo was still the gentleman outlaw, the quick-draw genius, the man who could face down Doc Holliday and live to tell it. But behind that legend was a lonely man standing in the ruins of his own life. And soon, that loneliness would drive him to the quietest and most mysterious ending of all. By 1882, the legend of Johnny Ringo had grown larger than the man himself. Across the frontier, people whispered his name in both fear and respect. He was the outlaw who read poetry, the gunfighter who quoted scripture, the man who faced down Doc Holliday and lived. But behind the legend, Johnny Ringo was fading. He had survived every duel, every feud, and every man who had come to test him. But he could not survive himself. The war inside him had become louder than the gunfights that once made him famous. After the OK Corral and Wyatt Earp's bloody vendetta, Tombstone was no longer the same. The Earps were gone, the cowboys were broken, and the once booming town began to fall silent. The streets that had once echoed with laughter and gunfire now carried only the sound of wind. For Johnny, the silence was unbearable. He had spent his life surrounded by noise, the chaos of war, the shouting in saloons, the clinking of whiskey glasses, the quick thunder of his revolver. But now, in the quiet, the ghosts began to speak. He heard his father's gunshot in his dreams. He saw the faces of men he'd killed staring at him from the shadows. He spoke their names sometimes, softly, as if trying to apologize. The West was moving on, becoming civilized. There were fewer places for men like Johnny Ringo, men who had lived too long by the law of the gun. The frontier was shrinking, and he had nowhere left to ride. He wandered through southern Arizona, drifting between towns, Galeyville, San Simon, Tombstone, Sierra Bonita. He worked for ranchers occasionally, helped herd cattle, and tried to keep busy. But the work never lasted. The bottle always found him. People who saw him during those months said he looked like a man carrying too much sorrow. His clothes were neat, his voice calm, but his eyes told the truth, eyes that had seen too much. He drank heavily, often alone, and his once sharp mind began to dull under the weight of whiskey and regret. Some said he talked to himself, that he muttered things under his breath when he thought no one was listening. Others said they found him sitting for hours by campfires, staring into the flames as if trying to burn his memories away. He was still respected, even admired. But he was no longer feared. The gentleman outlaw had become something quieter, a lonely man wandering through the ashes of his own legend. Friends tried to help. Some told him to leave Arizona, to start fresh somewhere new. But Johnny would just shake his head and smile faintly. "There's no new start for me," he said. "You can't outrun your own shadow." The few who got close enough to talk to him said he was kind, gentle even. He spoke with intelligence and sadness, as if he already knew how his story would end. By July of 1882, Johnny Ringo was living near the Chiricahua Mountains in an area called Turkey Creek Canyon. He kept mostly to himself, staying in a small camp near the trees, occasionally visiting nearby ranchers for supplies or company. The summer was hot, dry, and endless. Johnny drank more than ever. His friends noticed his words slurring, his temper thinning, and his loneliness deepening. He was last seen alive around July 13th. He bought whiskey, shared a few quiet words with locals, and rode off alone into the desert hills. No one saw him again. Days later, a rancher passing through Turkey Creek noticed a body sitting under a tree. It was a man slumped against the trunk, his head tilted forward. His revolver hung loosely from one hand, the hammer resting against his finger. It was Johnny Ringo. A single bullet wound pierced his temple. There were no signs of a struggle. His horse was found wandering nearby, his boots missing, likely taken off in the heat before he lay down to rest. The coroner ruled it a suicide. The official story said Johnny Ringo had shot himself in the head while drunk and depressed. But the West has never liked simple endings. Rumors spread fast. Some said Wyatt Earp had tracked him down and killed him in revenge. Others swore Doc Holliday had done it, though Holliday was in Colorado at the time. Still, others claimed Ringo was murdered by another outlaw, left staged to look like a suicide. No one truly knew. And maybe that was how Johnny would have wanted it. A mystery to outlive the man. Whatever the truth, the image was haunting. The once feared gunfighter sitting quietly beneath a tree, finally at peace or finally defeated. For years after his death, people passing through Turkey Creek claimed to see strange things. The sound of hoofbeats when no horses were near, a figure riding at sunset that vanished into the rocks, or a man's voice whispering words of regret. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is certain. Johnny Ringo's spirit never left the desert. He died as he lived, quietly, mysteriously, halfway between a legend and a man. The newspapers wrote short stories about his death. They called him a killer, a drunk, a gunfighter. But those who had truly known him said something different. They said he was a good man who lived in a bad time, a man born with too much heart and too little peace. In the end, Johnny Ringo wasn't destroyed by a bullet or a rival. He was destroyed by memory, by everything he carried inside. The morning sun rose slowly over Turkey Creek Canyon on July 14th, 1882. The desert air was still, heavy with heat, and nothing moved except the wind. Somewhere in that lonely canyon, under the shade of a cottonwood tree, a chapter of the Wild West quietly ended. Johnny Ringo, the man the newspapers called the King of the Cowboys, was dead. A local rancher named John Yost found him first. Yost had been riding through the canyon when he saw something unusual, a horse wandering without a rider. It looked tired and hungry, its saddle still on, reins dragging in the dirt. Yost followed the trail, expecting to find an injured cowboy. Instead, he found a man sitting under a tree, legs stretched out, head bowed forward. At first, Yost thought the man was asleep. But as he rode closer, he saw the blood. A single bullet hole marked the man's right temple. His gun hung loosely from one hand, the barrel resting against his leg. His hat lay beside him, his boots missing, and his face, though pale and lifeless, was calm, almost peaceful. It was Johnny Ringo, the same man who had once terrified Texas, outsmarted lawmen, and stood toe-to-toe with Doc Holliday, was now just another body in the desert. The coroner arrived the next day. He described the scene in his report with cold detail. John Ringo, aged 32 years, found sitting against a tree, a revolver in his right hand, a bullet wound in the right temple, exit on the left, body decomposed, death by gunshot, self-inflicted. It was ruled a suicide, but from the moment the report was written, no one believed it completely. The inconsistencies began immediately. Some said the gun found near his hand had one round fired, but no blood on it. Others claimed his hands were too clean for a self-inflicted wound. And then there were the boots, missing from the body, found later hanging from the saddle of his horse. Why would a man take off his boots before killing himself? Some said he was drunk, trying to cool his feet in the shade, and simply gave up. Others whispered darker theories, that he had been ambushed, shot while asleep, or passed out. And then came the rumors about Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. Earp was said to be in Arizona around that time, traveling south after his vendetta killings. Some claimed he tracked down Ringo to finish what had started in Tombstone. Others swore Doc Holliday slipped back into the territory, found Ringo drunk, and killed him in cold blood. But there was one problem. Doc Holliday had proof he was in Colorado when Ringo died, and Wyatt Earp never claimed responsibility. Still, the story was too good to die. It spread like wildfire through the frontier. The tale of two legends, meeting one last time in a canyon no one ever saw. Decades later, when Hollywood came calling, the myth grew even bigger. In movies, Ringo's death was often rewritten. He didn't take his own life. He was gunned down by Doc Holliday in a dramatic duel. It made for good cinema, but it wasn't the truth. The truth was quieter, sadder, and far more human. Johnny Ringo had spent his life running from his ghosts, and in the end, they finally caught him. He had lost his friends, his purpose, and his place in a world that no longer wanted men like him. The law had tamed the frontier, but there was no law that could save his mind. In his final days, witnesses said he looked worn and hopeless. He talked about feeling tired of it all. One rancher remembered him saying, "There's no use fighting it anymore. The world's moved on. It's possible that Johnny Ringo didn't die because of enemies, but because of emptiness. The same courage that made him fearless in battle may have driven him to face the one fight he couldn't win, the one against himself." After his death, a few loyal friends buried him right there, near the tree where he fell. They dug a shallow grave in the hard desert soil and marked it with stones. Over time, wind and rain wore the marker away, but the legend remained. People who passed through Turkey Creek in the years after claimed they could feel something there. A strange stillness, like the air itself was holding its breath. Some said they saw a lone rider at sunset, disappearing into the canyon just as the light faded. To this day, the small grave under that cottonwood tree remains. It's unassuming, just a patch of desert earth beside the creek. Tourists visit, take photos, and leave behind coins or bullets as tribute. Few realize that the man buried there was more than an outlaw. Johnny Ringo was a mirror of the West itself, wild, tragic, and misunderstood. He wasn't the monster the newspapers made him out to be, nor the hero of dime novels. He was a man who tried to find peace in a violent time and never found it. Maybe that's why his legend endures. Because somewhere, deep down, every soul that's ever been lost in the world understands Johnny Ringo. He was brave, intelligent, broken, and human, and like all ghosts of the Old West, he never really left. When Johnny Ringo died, the desert didn't notice. The wind blew over his shallow grave, carrying away the footprints, the dust, and the silence. In that moment, he became just another man claimed by the wilderness. But legends have a strange way of surviving, even when the men who inspired them are long gone. News of Johnny Ringo's death spread slowly at first, printed in small-town newspapers and passed along in whispers at saloons. Most people didn't believe it. How could a man like Johnny Ringo, the smartest, fastest, coldest gun in the West, simply die alone under a tree? Some said the report was a lie. Others said it was a trick, that Ringo had faked his death and disappeared into Mexico. A few swore they'd seen him alive years later, riding along dusty trails at sunset. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Johnny Ringo, the haunted gunslinger, had finally found peace, or at least silence. In the years after his death, Tombstone began to fade. The silver mines ran dry, the crowds moved on, and the Wild West started to disappear. But stories, and the kind told by firelight and whiskey, never really die. Cowboys still talked about him on long nights. They told tales of the soft-spoken outlaw who could quote Shakespeare and draw faster than lightning. They said he had eyes that could see right through a man, calm, blue, and empty. He became more than a memory. He became a myth. Writers picked up his story and turned it into something larger. In dime novels, Ringo was painted as the perfect outlaw, handsome, fearless, untouchable. In others, he was the tragic hero, the man who wanted peace but lived in violence. Every author saw something different in him, and every version pulled him further from the truth. The real Johnny Ringo was complicated, thoughtful, and broken. But myths need simplicity, and so the haunted gunslinger became whatever people wanted him to be. A villain for some, a hero for others, a ghost for everyone. Years passed, and the old names of the West began to fade. The Earps, the Clantons, the Cowboys. But when Hollywood arrived, the past came roaring back to life. In the 1930s and 1940s, Western movies swept across America, and Johnny Ringo's legend rose again. He was cast as a cold-blooded killer in some films, a noble anti-hero in others. Each actor who played him added something new. A smirk, a stare, a sadness. But none could capture the man himself. In 1959, a TV show called The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp showed Ringo as a dark, intelligent rival, and audiences loved him. Then came Tombstone in 1993, where actor Michael Biehn brought him to life again. Pale eyes, quiet voice, trembling with rage and sorrow. It was the closest Hollywood had ever come to showing the truth. A man torn between brilliance and despair. But long before the movies, long before the scripts and the cameras, the legend had already begun, in the minds of those who had seen him, or heard of him, or simply needed a ghost to believe in. Even today, in the deserts of southern Arizona, people visit Johnny Ringo's grave. It's a small, simple site near Turkey Creek Canyon, surrounded by old cottonwoods. There's no grand monument, no marble statue, just stones and a wooden fence. Visitors leave coins, bullets, crosses, and whiskey bottles, as if he might still rise and take one last drink. Locals say the air around that grave feels different, heavier somehow, as if the earth itself remembers. Some visitors claim to have heard footsteps behind them, or whispers on the wind. Others say they've seen a lone figure standing by the tree where he died, dressed in dusty clothes, eyes shining like cold glass under the moon. Whether those stories are real or not doesn't matter. Because in every way that counts, Johnny Ringo never really died. He became the spirit of the West itself, proud, restless, and searching. A reminder of a time when men carried both wisdom and death on their hips. For historians, he remains a puzzle. For writers, a muse. For dreamers, a warning. He lived by his own code, not good, not evil, just human. And in that humanity, he became something eternal. It's easy to see why his legend endures. Johnny Ringo represents the part of every person that feels lost between who they are and who they want to be. He's the quiet soul who walks away from the crowd, burdened by thought and regret, yet still searching for peace. He was a man who didn't fit his time, too smart for the life he led, too proud to escape it. In a world that rewards loudness and power, Johnny Ringo's silence spoke louder than gunfire. Today, his story is told in books, films, and songs. But the truest version doesn't live on a screen or a page. It lives in the desert wind, whispering through the canyons where he fell. It lives in the idea that even the hardest men can be fragile, that behind every legend, there's a person who once tried to be better. The West created many heroes and villains. But Johnny Ringo was neither. He was something rarer, a man who became a legend not because he conquered the world, but because he never could conquer himself. More than a century has passed since Johnny Ringo's death, but his story still drifts through time like desert dust. He has become one of those rare figures who refuse to fade, a man who stepped out of history and into legend. Even now, people can't agree on who Johnny Ringo really was. To some, he was a murderer, a drunk, a gunfighter who met the ending he deserved. To others, he was a misunderstood soul, a poet with a pistol, a man too thoughtful for the savage world he lived in. Maybe both are true. The beauty and tragedy of Johnny Ringo's legacy lie in that uncertainty. He is not remembered because he won battles or built cities, but because he stood in the middle of everything the Old West represented: honor, chaos, loneliness, and pride, and he never quite chose a side. When historians talk about the American frontier, they often divide people into two groups, heroes and outlaws. But Ringo lived in the space between. He wasn't a lawman like Wyatt Earp, nor a reckless killer like Curly Bill Brocious. He was something more human, intelligent, emotional, and deeply flawed. That complexity is what kept his name alive. Over the years, writers have tried to capture his essence, each one seeing something new in the man beneath the legend. Some called him a fallen angel, others a wandering ghost. But they all agreed on one thing: Johnny Ringo was unforgettable. Even those who studied the Old West closely found themselves drawn to him. There was a mystery in his calm demeanor, in the contradictions of his life. A man who read philosophy yet lived by the gun, who sought peace yet kept finding war. He became a symbol of the haunted outlaw, the man cursed to walk the edge between good and evil. In many ways, Ringo's story marked the end of an era. He represented the final generation of men who lived by instinct rather than law. When he died, the frontier began to fade, replaced by towns, railroads, and civilization. The land that once belonged to drifters and dreamers now belonged to businessmen and politicians. And the ghosts of the West, men like Ringo, were left behind. But legends don't stay buried. Through time, his image evolved with each generation. In the early 1900s, ballads and campfire songs told of the lonely gunman who could never find rest. By the 1950s, television turned him into a handsome anti-hero, a symbol of rebellion, independence, and the price of pride. And when Hollywood returned to his story decades later, his spirit found a new home on the big screen. The 1993 film Tombstone gave audiences a version of Johnny Ringo that felt eerily real. Actor Michael Biehn portrayed him not just as a villain, but as a man haunted by intelligence and pain, a man who could quote Latin scripture before pulling the trigger. That performance reignited the fascination with Ringo, introducing him to a new generation who saw him not as a monster, but as a mirror of human struggle. Today, his story lives on not only in books and films, but in the land itself. If you visit Cochise County, Arizona, and drive down the lonely roads near Turkey Creek Canyon, you can still find his grave. It's a quiet spot surrounded by mesquite trees and red earth, marked by a simple wooden sign. Visitors come from all over the world to stand there, not out of fear, but out of respect. They leave small tokens, bullets, coins, bits of rope, and even pages of poetry. Each offering is a reminder that Johnny Ringo's life still means something, that even in death his story continues to speak. Perhaps it's because he represents a truth that never grows old, the truth that strength and sorrow often walk together. Johnny Ringo wasn't the fastest gun in the West, nor the most famous, but he was something far more rare, real. A man caught between what he wanted to be and what the world forced him to become. His legacy reminds us that legends are not made from perfection. They're made from pain, failure, and the courage to keep going anyway. He lived in a world that offered no forgiveness, yet somehow his story still inspires empathy. We see in him the reflection of our own struggles, the fight to find peace, the need to be understood, the fear of being forgotten, and maybe that's why his ghost still rides. Because Johnny Ringo isn't just a man from the past. He's a piece of the human spirit that refuses to rest. He belongs to that timeless space where history and myth meet, where the lonely rider disappears into the horizon, his shadow stretching behind him as the sun sinks low. In that fading light, Johnny Ringo still lives. Not as a killer, not as a hero, but as something eternal, a man who walked through life searching for redemption, and in his failure to find it, became immortal. The desert doesn't forget. It keeps its secrets buried in sand and silence, stories of men who lived fast, loved fiercely, and died young. Among those stories, one name still echoes across the canyons: Johnny Ringo. More than a century after his death, his shadow still rides with the wind. When the sun dips below the Arizona hills and the sky burns red, you can almost see him there, a lone rider on a pale horse, drifting toward the horizon. Johnny Ringo's life was short, but it burned bright. He was a man of contradictions, a killer with a conscience, a philosopher with a gun. He could read poetry by firelight and end a man's life before the flame flickered. He was feared, admired, and misunderstood. And in the end, he became a legend not because of what he did, but because of who he was. He never robbed a bank. He never led a gang. He never claimed to be a hero. He was simply a man trying to survive in a world that didn't know what to do with men like him. The West was full of killers, but few of them had souls like Johnny Ringo. Most men shot for gold, for pride, or for revenge. Ringo shot because he didn't know any other way to quiet the noise inside him. The same mind that made him wise also made him restless. He carried his father's death with him like a shadow that never left. It followed him through every gunfight, every dusty road, every empty night spent with a bottle and his thoughts. Maybe that's why he seemed so calm, because he'd already accepted how it would end. People often talk about courage as the act of standing tall in front of danger. But there's another kind of courage, the kind that faces the truth about oneself. And in that sense, Johnny Ringo might have been the bravest man in the West. He faced a world that was changing too fast, a world that no longer had a place for gunslingers or drifters. The frontier was closing. The age of lawless men was over, and the new America, the one with cities, courts, and rules, had no room for ghosts like him. But his story didn't die with him. It became a mirror for generations that followed, a reflection of every human heart that's ever felt torn between darkness and light. Writers and filmmakers turned him into a symbol, the haunted outlaw, doomed to walk the earth searching for redemption he'd never find. But the truth is simpler. Johnny Ringo wasn't searching for redemption. He was searching for peace. He never found it in the bottle, in the gun, or in the company of men who rode beside him. He looked for it in the desert, in the stars, in silence. But the ghosts always found him first. When people visit his grave today, they often stand there in silence, unsure what to say. Because what can you really say to a man like Johnny Ringo? A man who lived between worlds, between law and chaos, between pride and pain, between life and legend. Some leave whiskey bottles, as if to share one last drink. Some whisper prayers. Others just stand there letting the hot wind tell his story. The truth is, Johnny Ringo's story belongs to everyone. It belongs to anyone who's ever carried regret, who's ever felt trapped by their own past, who's ever wondered if peace was even possible. Because Ringo's life wasn't about killing. It was about feeling too deeply in a time that punished emotion. That's why, more than a century later, his name still lives. He wasn't the best gunfighter. He wasn't the fastest or the most famous, but he was real. And in a world of myths, being real is the rarest thing of all. In the end, Johnny Ringo's greatest legacy isn't the bullets he fired or the men he faced. It's the truth he left behind. That even the strongest souls can be fragile. That even the toughest men can be haunted. That no matter how far you ride, you can't escape yourself. And maybe that's why his ghost still lingers in the Arizona dusk. Not as a warning, but as a whisper. A reminder that behind every legend is a human heart. And behind every gun is a man who once just wanted to live in peace. The world may have moved on, but the desert remembers. And somewhere out there, when the night grows quiet and the wind moves through the canyon, you might just hear it, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Johnny Ringo, the haunted gunslinger, riding one last time into the endless west.